Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Wilfred Rubens, and I work as an independent consultant in the field of technology-enhanced learning. And this is a question I want to raise this afternoon. And I think this is a very important question because it's what we all about to do, what we all try to achieve, to enhance how we can learn, how we can realize effective learning and training. Several years ago, I was asked to attend the Dutch Open University, where an innovative project was started. It was called OpenU. And OpenU was a project in which we developed a personal learning environment, in which we developed several alternative learning activities like massive open online courses or online masterclasses. And the focus in this project was especially on lifelong learning and on realizing academic binding. But we also developed learning functionalities that could be used for providing courses. For example, we did the Master Education and Sciences of the Open University. We provided this master in OpenU in this environment. But OpenU was a project, and a few years ago we had a new board, and the board said, well, we have 3 learning environments here, and we want that we only have 1 learning environment. And a quite intensive selection process was started, and the conclusion was, based on advice, that the Open University should construct and implement a virtual learning environment based on Liferay. So we started a new project where we took the lessons learned from the OpenU project, and where we developed a new learning environment that is called ULearn nowadays. And the focus of ULearn was to foster first bachelor and master education, first master education, now bachelor education. But lifelong learning, how we can foster that, will follow as well. So both OpenU and Liferay and ULearn are based on Liferay. I worked first for the at the Open University, and now I still work for the Open University, but now as an independent consultant. And I am one of the project leaders of this in this ULearn program. And if you want to hear more about the project, there are a few colleagues here in front of me who are deeply involved in ULearn, so you can ask them about the experiences as well. On the background, you see a screen dump of ULearn, the new learning environment. Okay. Switch. What we back to the question that I want to raise this afternoon. Since decades we use technology in education, and since the late 90s we are using internet technology for learning, training, and education as well. But what we often do is that we try to replace books by online environments. And if you Google, for example, on images about e-learning or blended learning, then often you get the metaphor of a book in a computer. But I don't think that this is the way that we should use e-learning, that we should develop e-learning. And the famous educational researcher from New Zealand, John Hattie, he concluded in 2009 that if we are developing e-learning or blended learning, we often ignore the basic knowledge that we have about learning design, about instructional design, and about pedagogy. So I think that's a very important lesson, important reminder that we need to be aware of. Because this kind of learning, this doesn't lead to effective learning, to efficient learning, or to engaging learning, as you can see here. So it's not a very good way of learning, and I think that we should do more and should spend more efforts in realizing very good e-learning or blended learning. So in this presentation, I want to address what is effective e-learning. Is technology-enhanced learning, is the use of technology for learning, is it effective? What does research say? And how can we, in fact, use technology to foster principles for effective instruction? So how can we use technology to realize these powerful learning environments? That is the most important question that we are focused right now with. So I want to first, before I go into what is effective learning, I want to ask you a question, and I want you to grab your smartphone or tablet, and I hope it has a connection with Wi-Fi in the meantime, because downstairs the code was visible in Culemborg. The network is free. And I want to ask you a question. So if you're ready, go with your smartphone to govote.at, and you have to put in a code there. There is also a question: would you like to attend presentations in a location nearby? Don't do that, but just put in the code and vote. There is a question ready, and the question is: what is your most favorite evidence-based learning activity facilitated by ICT? So I guess you all have experiences, maybe as a student or as a teacher, in blended learning or e-learning. You are using different kinds of learning activities, but what is your most evidence-based, so that's proven that it works, learning activity that you facilitate with ICT? You can give one word in, so you can fill in one word. Do we have a stable connection here? I hope so. Okay, there are. I will go to the results, but the code and the internet address will show up in the meantime. There it comes. There are several. Okay, 20 votes. You can of course still vote, but I want to address some of them. That's very interesting. Shopping, for example. I'm not sure if shopping is a learning activity, but maybe someone wants to explain, wants to add something to it. Comment why they put shopping as the most evidence-based learning activity. Okay. Valamis, well, that's obviously because there must be people from Valamis here, but what is interesting, for example, who voted for YouTube? Yeah, why is YouTube effective? Can I ask you, mister?
Because you can find solutions for any question you have.
Okay, you can find solutions for any question you have. Search, maybe the same reason. Yeah. Well, just just watching video or just searching on the internet, these activities alone are not really effective learning activities, research shows. So you have to do with it something with it, so it becomes an evidence-based learning activity. Who put on a test? Yeah? You, sir?
Yes.
Why is test an effective learning activity?
Because I think it helps you with in an adaptive learning process.
Yeah.
You can test if you know something and if you don't know it.
Yeah.
Usually by doing the test itself, you already learn. But if you already know what you don't know, then you can try to improve yourself and test again. So
Yeah.
it's very direct.
So.
Offline, it's more difficult to do that.
Yeah. So testing provides you information about where you stand as a learner. That's true. That's testing, especially formative testing, is excellent. It's an excellent learning activity. So, but it's based. The learning activity is depends on the feedback you provide. So that's the most important. That it is most exciting about formative testing. MOOCs. There are effective MOOCs and there are ineffective MOOCs. It depends on what you are doing in it. So it's quite difficult. And for example, somebody also said, well, regretfully none. That can, of course, have different reasons. Maybe you're not involved in the e-learning business as a teacher or as a student. But I think that in a lot of online courses, for example, we apply learning activities that are not really evidence-based, so you could say learning activities. Okay. Interesting, UGent online learning environment, I think from the University of Ghent. Okay, let's go to my presentation. Thank you for responding. Where is it? Here it is. What is effective learning? Well, this, of course, is a learning activity that is very common in universities of applied sciences, but also in other educational institutes. A teacher who tells you things and students are in the room writing down notes, etc. Nowadays, they use often laptops or tablets to write notes, which is less effective than writing on paper, in fact. But this is what we see, and what we still see. There's a known picture, but this is what we still see in a lot of universities as one of the most important learning activities. However, this is a conclusion from a meta study on where they compared lecturing versus more active learning activities, where students actually do and not only sit, listen, and write down. And they said, well, in fact, if you look at research, then the conclusion is obviously active learning leads to better learning results. And this is one of the quotes in this research. And the researcher says, well, it's very strange that we still are using learning activities that aren't very effective, and that these more lecturing, the traditional lecturing, that it's still used while it's hardly contributes to effective learning. And he said, well, in fact, we should use more active learning in our institutes. But still, as said, we use this kind of learning activities. What we do if we are applying ICT in education, if we are using technology-enhanced learning, we in fact often replace the ineffective lecture with ineffective ways of technology-enhanced learning. And that's not a really good thing, because what we have to do also in e-learning or blended learning, we have to stimulate students that they use their brains actively. So it's not active learning is not that you should exercise a lot, but exercise in fact helps learning. But it's not what I mean here. You should engage students. You should really activate their brains by different learning activities. So if you apply these kind of learning activities, if you really use your learning activities like tests, for example, like self-tests or formative tests, then you stimulate the brain and then students will learn. And John Hattie, the researcher I mentioned before, he wrote a book, it's called Visible Learning, and this book is one of the most famous books in educational sciences, and he describes a lot of interventions that you can use in education, and he said, well, I did, I believe 50,000 studies he used, to draw some conclusions in what works and what doesn't work. And he has also some parts about technology-enhanced learning. And in fact, Hattie isn't that positive about technology-enhanced learning. Few things to say about it. The research he uses is often quite old, about 2002 or older, so they are not writing about, for example, the use of virtual learning environments or the use of social media for learning activities. So that is not in his study, but he has several studies, a huge amount of studies, where computer or ICT is used for learning. And in fact, the medium doesn't really matter for the effectivity. But what he also finds, and that is very striking, is that if you look at these studies and you look at the effect scores, there is a huge difference between different studies. So in one study, it seems that ICT is very helpful for learning, that there is a high effect of the use of ICT for learning, and in other studies there is a low effect or no effect. And I think this conclusion, this phenomenon is rather promising and interesting to watch. Some conclusions. Hattie looks, Hattie, for example, is writing about web-based learning. However, web-based learning is not the use of virtual learning environments. But web-based learning is using, for example, search engines to search for information. And if you only use search engines for information, if you say to students, well, this is a subject, find information and study it, and then we have a test, at the end, that's not very effective. It's not ineffective, but it doesn't really contribute to learning, because what Hattie also says is that you should have an effect size of at least 0.4, and you see here that there is an effect size of 0.18, and that is not really effective. He's more positive about interactive video methods, but then you must remember that these not only are videos watching, but interactive video methods. So you watch the video, you get questions, you answer them, etc. That is an example of an interactive video method, and there is an effect size that says, well, yes, these kind of methods, they contribute to learning, to effective learning. Simulations, he isn't very positive about simulations as well, but there are very good simulations and there are very bad simulations, but overall the effect size is quite low. So, but there are several differences in simulations as well. And Hattie also, he doesn't really look at distance education and online distance educational separately, but he pays some attention to it as well. He doesn't have an effect size for it. He has an effect size of distance education. But what he says is very interesting, and it is that what kind of tools you use, what kind of learning technologies you use in distance education, that doesn't matter how you apply it, what you are doing with it. That influences if distance learning is more or less effective. So that's a very important. That is a very important message from his research. What he also says is that there are several factors that influence if technology is more or less effective if you want to apply it for learning. For example, he says, don't use technology to replace a teacher, but use technology to add something to the traditional ways of learning. And he says different diversity in teaching strategies. If you use that, then learning with ICT becomes more effective. He also said that you should invest in professional development, and not only in how these machines are used, but how you can use it in a pedagogical way. For example, and he also said that you should invest at least 10 hours in professional development. Professional development will be effective for learning? If it's less, it often is counterproductive. So that's an important thing, because what we do often in educational institutes is that we organize an afternoon and we expect people that they know how to apply ICT in their classroom, and that's not a very effective way. He also says, well, you should have more of students should have more possibilities for learning. So they should have, for example, a lot of possibilities to practice, to do tests, to do some drill and practice that is effective for children, not for adults. But there are several, he says, well, you should give learners more possibilities to learn. Interesting is also that he says, well, if a student has more control over his own learning, then the use of ICT, the use of computers for education is more effective. But if you look at the effect of learner control as such, then there is a quite a low effect. He also says what is very important is that you apply peer learning, so that you do not use that students not use a computer on their own, but that they use it in pairs, in duos. So one computer for a group isn't effective, one computer for an individual learner often isn't effective, but the most effective thing is that students together use one device for learning. And also he says, well, feedback is very important on different kind of learning activities, and feedback he finds is a very, very effective way for enhancing learning as well. Valamis also asked me to, and Liferay also asked me to address something about social learning, because social learning, I think, is a very important development. And last year I wrote together with a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, a small book about social learning and the use of social media for learning. It's in Dutch. And if you look at what social learning, for example, is, then you see some very interesting phenomena. But first I want to ask you a question to you. When do you think that the term social learning is introduced? And I give you several time frames. Do you think that the term social learning is older than 1980? Is it, for example, was it dropped, was it introduced for the first time in the period 1980-1995, 1995, 2000, or 2000 till 2015? What do you think, when was the term social learning introduced the first time? I go to yes, okay. That's true. It's older than, and most of the people say it's older than 1980, and that's true. The term social learning, if I'm not mistaken, was the first time, who knows who introduces the term social learning for the first time? Vygotsky, no, Vygotsky is 1933. Yeah? He didn't introduce the term social learning. Somebody else? In the back, I saw a finger. No? Plato. Not Plato, no. I thought you knew, Henry, but it's Albert Bandura, 1977, if I'm not mistaken. Bandura is a learning theorist who introduced the term social learning. And what he, for example, says, well, social learning, he dropped the term social learning theory. For example, he says what is very important is that people have self-efficacy, so that they believe that they are able to do the task. But he also says, well, learning takes place in a triangle. And learning takes place always in the social context, in the environmental factors, he calls it. But learning especially takes place if a person sees somebody else acting. So a person, a learner, he observes behavior of, for example, an expert. And the learner, he draws conclusions from what he sees are reactions on that behavior. For example, if somebody, if you see, for example, a presenter using tools and have success with learners, then you can try to do that behavior as well. So sort of copying, but it's more a learner uses the expert, for example, as a model. So modeling is very important in this theory. No, that's wrong direction. Social learning today, however, if people are talking about social learning, they are talking about more collaborative ways of learning. So where people, where learners in a group, in a team, work together at the same goals. Modeling as well is introduced in nowadays. But in fact, a few years ago, when the term social learning was reintroduced again, people were talking only about using social media for learning, using social media for collaborative learning or for interactive learning, etc. And what also is important in the current description of social learning is that they say, well, yeah, people do have a lot of control about how and what they want to learn as well. So this is more how nowadays we are talking about social learning. And if you are looking at how effective this is, and you go back to, for example, Hattie, but also other research, then you see that collaborative learning can be effective. But on the other hand, collaborative learning, if you try to do that kind of learning, is very complex to organize. For example, you have to invest a lot of time in forming teams. And not only putting people together, but make sure that they have the same goals, that they share the norms about how to collaborate. So it's very important to take time in team construction, you could say, before collaborative learning is effective. And what people also say is, what we also know is that the task on which people work together, learn together, is a very influential factor on if collaborative learning will work or not. So if you have a very easy task, then collaborative learning won't be a success. But if you have a challenging task, and people, but it's not too difficult, and now we come to Vygotsky, then social learning, then collaborative learning can be a very effective way of learning. Modeling, modeling can be very effective. Interactive learning, interaction is very important for learning as well, but interaction can also be interaction with a program. For example, feedback, you can get feedback from a program, and a lot of people say, well, I like this kind of feedback because it's more safe for me than if I get feedback from a person. Using social media for learning, there is limited research on the effects of social media for learning. There is some research done about, for example, blogging, and blogging, if you want to realize deep learning, if you want to promote reflection, blogging can be very useful. But if you are having a quite simple task, then don't use blogging, but because it's too complex for students. And there are a lot of differences in about the effect of if learner control is effective or not. what we know is that students need to learn how to take control about the learning before you give them control about the learning. That is a very important lesson. So if you say, well, we are going to apply social learning, and people have a lot of things to say, but they don't know, for example, how to regulate themselves, then learning will not be very effective. So technology-enhanced learning can be an effective way of learning. You can, the way you, not the medium, but the way you use technology for learning is a very important part if that influences if learning will be successful or not. And what we also see is that you should think very good about your learning design or about the pedagogy that you want to apply for learning. For example, formative evaluation is very effective. If you use that, that's a very good thing for learning. Interaction, as said before, and timely feedback is very important as well. And in my opinion, what we should do, for example, in technology-enhanced learning, we should look at what David Merrill several years ago concluded. He said, well, there are several first principles for effective instruction. Merrill also did a lot of research on what works in learning and what not. And he says we should always start with a problem, a real-world problem that learners should solve, a very complex problem, but you should be able to divide this problem in smaller tasks as well. Second, you should activate the knowledge that people already have about a certain subject. So this is important as well. You should demonstrate how, for example, a concept or a model works. Students should be able to apply it, so not only listen to it, but also do something with it. And the last step is that students should be able to integrate what they have learned in their daily work. And these 5 principles, you can, in fact, you can use technology. You can use technology to foster these first principles. For example, you can use a video about a case, about a realistic case, about a realistic problem, and introduce this video before students learn. So you make sure that they can see what the problem is they will work on the next few weeks, for example. This is, for example, an example still from a video that is used in, how do you say in English, company emergency, bedrijfshulpverlening. So that you can use really authentic situations in this video to address a problem that you want students to work on. Activation phase can be used. You can, for example, use student response systems like Multimedia that I used before as well to check if people already have some knowledge about the subject that you want to address, or that you can use to check if students, for example, have read a text or have watched a video, if they understood the problem. And research shows that these kind of tools can be effective if you add feedback to it as well. So if you see what students are answering and you go into what they did answer. When you ask the questions immediately after a small instruction, or at the end of a problem, that doesn't influence the effectivity. You can also use videos. In the Netherlands, we are now talking about Kennis clips. I call them here knowledge clips. I'm not sure if somebody else in Sweden or Germany who is here in the room understands what I know, but these are very short videos where a student, where a teacher, for example, introduces a problem or introduces a theory, etc. A worked out example is also an example of this of a way you can use technology. So you can, for example, provide a text or an article, etc. What also is important if you are developing if you are developing videos, for example, is that you apply what Richard Meyer calls the multimedia principles. And these principles, I don't have the time to go into them deeply. They, for example, say that you can better apply more media, that the multimedia principle, so that you can combine, for example, pictures and spoken text, of pictures and written words. It's preferable to use them than words only. Or you can use, for example, it's better to use pictures and narrations than pictures and written text. So there are a lot of principles, a lot of known of how effective videos or how effective animations should be constructed. In the application phase, for example, students should do things and should receive feedback. Self-test, for example, is very important, but also that you give students guidance, but that you diminish the guidance during the process, and that's called scaffolding. So there are a lot of things you can use technology for also in this application phase. For example, in a serious game, in a well-designed serious game, you can students let act on what they have learned, and also in a well-designed simulation, you can let students practice about what they have learned as well. Integration phase, for example, when they apply what they have learned in their daily practice, then, for example, a digital portfolio can be an effective way of learning if the digital portfolio is used in combination with feedback as well. So students can reflect on how they apply new knowledge in their daily practice, and they can talk about it, for example, with their supervisor. Have we time for another question, or? Yeah? Last question. I want to ask you, what do you think? Can we improve education and training with learning technology? And I have here, I have to switch to another question. And what I want to ask you is, choose, you have several options. Do you think it's complex, or is it more or less complex? Is it achievable? Can it be done? And can it be done by you? Or can it be done by your colleagues? What do you think? So it's these are axes, and you can pick a position on these axes for yourself. So people here, on average, of course, think that they can do it, and it's more achievable for them in personal than for their colleagues, and it's quite complex. And I think that's true. I agree with this position. It can be done, but it's not an easy job to do.
Good
this
timing.
is my presentation. Maybe, I don't know, Koen, if there is some room for some questions?
Well, it's already on your sign, so if there's any questions, this is your time or time slot to ask questions to Wilfred. Anyone in particular? Oh, wow, okay.
And
so no one will talk with Wilfred today anymore, right? Because there's no time to intervene with him afterwards, so he's only here now. Still no questions.
Wow. I'm here the complete afternoon, so. But during lunch, someone told to me that once a professor told him that he said, "Well, I give great lectures because no one has ever a question." I don't hope that this is a conclusion here in this room as well. So.
All right. Well, maybe one opinion, and maybe that's my selfish one, but questions are there to ask, right?
Yeah.
It's a discussion point. To me, MOOCs are a marketing tool. Do you agree?
Partly, yes. It's for some institutes, it definitely is a marketing tool, but it's not. But it's not only a marketing tool. It's also a way to give people who don't have access normally to higher education access to higher education. It's a way to. It's an instrument for valorization of your research, for example, as a university. And it can be, especially for lifelong learning, it can be a very effective learning activity. And what you also see now is that there are universities who say, well, if you have a certificate of a MOOC, then we will recognize it here as a university. So it's more than just marketing.
All right. Okay, thank you for this.
Henry?
When you talk about learning technology, please explain to me what you mean by learning technology. Is it technology that has been designed for learning, or can we use other technology as well?
Yeah.
What do you mean by learning?
Yeah.
Is it supposed to invoke learning? Should we use what vendors offer?
No, a good question. I jumped. I didn't go into it. Learning technology, in my opinion, is every technology that you can use for learning. So sometimes it's designed for learning, but a lot of technologies that we are using for learning, for example, Liferay itself, it's not originally designed for learning or developed for learning, but we use it for learning. Weblogs are not designed for learning, but we use it for learning. Learning technologies are also technologies that are not originally developed for learning, but can be used for learning. Yep.
Okay, thank you very much, Wilfred.
You're welcome.
Have a small present for you. Yeah, thank you. Give Wilfred a round of applause.